So exciting to have you on the Pleasure Projects Under the Duvet. And we really wanted to have you on Under the Duvet because of all the amazing work you've been doing with Love Matters and elsewhere to bring sex education online, to bring sex education that's real, that really people can relate to. And thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your time, and thank you so much for getting under the duvet. I know it might be a bit hot in Delhi, but first of all, I just wanted to ask you about, just how it is in India at the moment, how it's been with COVID, and what you think the implications are of COVID in India for sex education and pleasure.
Thanks, and I thank you for this wonderful opportunity. It is wonderful to have this conversation literally under the duvet. So talking about COVID, I think we can see the numbers are rising. I mean, what we have seen, at the different stages of lockdown, which were, intended to sort of have certain structures in place before the numbers sort of started rising, and just to make sure that the community transmission was sort of controlled. But at some point things had to open up. We couldn't have afforded this lockdown for a very long time. Businesses have suffered, people have suffered, and of course when we talk about the most marginalized population who are at a huge disadvantage, as always, this is not for the first time. Any kind of pandemic, any kind of issue, they are the ones who are disproportionately affected. That's the same reality at this point of time. So when it comes to when we are looking at young people, or when we are looking at sexual and reproductive health and rights, when we're looking at pleasure, all of those indicators are severely affected. Incomes have been affected, financial situations have been affected. When we talk about agency, when we talk about just simple things of being able to access schools, access information, access services, all of those things have been affected. And I think I think there is particularly no attention to sexual pleasure. Because I think there's been such a confusing state of just dealing with the crisis, and everything new that has sort of been thrown in, that I don't think anyone was prepared. I see all organizations working on sexual and reproductive health and rights, or more popularly known as family planning organizations, really worried and talking about unwanted pregnancies, talking about nutritional needs, talking about reproductive health, and talking about unsafe abortions. And all of these are very, very important topics, but no one's really talking about sex positive information at this point of time, and sexual pleasure.
Yeah, which is really striking, considering that, the pandemic has also meant that more people have been going online. They've been having to have their relationships and their sex lives in a new way for many people. There's still been a need for us to think about intimacy needs, romance needs, sexual needs. And it was great to talk with you on the panel for World Sexual Health Day with the World Association of Sexual Health. And the topic was pleasure in the times of COVID. And there was you made some really great points there. And there was some really interesting conversation about just what that means. So what do you think that has meant in India? Have you seen like a rise in interest in internet information, or the kind of information that people are seeking during lockdown?
Yes, and we can also say that because we saw a huge rise in numbers, on the website, across the platforms, and the number of questions that people were asking, sharing their stories. So we did see a huge surge in numbers, and a lot of conversations and questions that people were interested in were around spicing up their sex lives, or a fear of having sex because of COVID. I think those were sort of a real huge rise in numbers. So it was also around myths and misconceptions, and how little we were talking about sex and relationships, and how to have pleasureful relationships wherever you are, in whatever situations you are, with yourself or with your partner or partners. So, I mean, in context of people seeking information, huge spike. I think in terms of people seeking services, again, huge need. but everybody was confused in terms of how to access these services. I mean, young people felt extremely restricted because they were either homebound or in situations where they didn't know how to access services, how much information they'll need to share, will it be compromising their anonymity, certain services that they needed, that they felt were really needed, but there was just no way of accessing those services. We work in the communities, with young people in communities in Bihar, in Rajasthan, in Jharkhand, and something that we saw there was, even sanitary napkins were not available. So just essential services like sanitary napkins and those seeing some hygiene products were not available and were not easily available. Plus the loss of income in families, which made it even more difficult to sort of talk about affordability of certain necessities. So then to think about any kind of pleasure product. Let's say just talk about condoms. There was no way they felt it was comfortable accessing a condom or even going out and felt very restricted within families in terms of privacy, in terms of just exercising their right to pleasure, but also just felt extremely restricted in terms of not being able to go out and socialize and meet other people. So everything felt extremely restricted in communities, and there have been huge implications on product supplies, and this how the supply chains were hit, and it fell, and the demand was there, but the supply chains just couldn't feed into the demand, and it wasn't organized. Something that COVID has also taught us that is the fact that we never sort of planned for any such situation in advance. The companies didn't, the businesses did not plan for it, the government didn't plan for it. When we talk about government departments or the medical departments or even hospitals, they did not plan for it. And then the fear, the myths and misconceptions around COVID made it even more difficult because people were scared. People were scared of going out and even seeking information. They were seeking information, but we also felt extremely restricted, to be very honest. We were trying very hard to connect them to services and connect them to products, but we didn't know how to make sure that there is enough supply. How do we get the supply there? We did do work directly in the community with our community-based network to get the products to people, but it is not very easy. And for us, we had to restrict ourselves when it came to condoms because we work with a lot of young unmarried couples, and in the kits we were not. We couldn't do we couldn't add condoms, and we felt extremely restricted. Plus, we did not get the supply of condoms as well. So things have been extremely tricky that way.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good reminder about also young people's fears and feelings of legitimacy in terms of asking for products in their family or home environment, and what's classed as necessity or what's classed as affordable. Obviously when a family's struggling for food, of course, like the feeling of being able to ask for a condom, and when that's taboo already, or a sanitary towel is something that's really challenging. But one thing that's really struck me is how the kind of landscape of sexual health has changed so much due to COVID. And that was to some extent a change that was starting to happen around self-care. I know in the UK that a lot of young people now use home testing STI kits, and they're sent to their house, and then they send away for the result, and it allows them to have that anonymity. But there's been a kind of also a big push, a necessary push to say telemedicine, radio, internet. Yeah. And, a number of countries have seen big rises in that just because it had to happen. But I wonder if that's something that you see as practical or feasible in the context in which you work, or is it just beyond the realms of what's practically or possible or affordable?
I think it is. I think it's a very practical thing to do. I think that is the future. I definitely think it is doable. Just in context of India, there cannot be a one size fit all option that would work everywhere and for everyone, and that would be a dream come true. I mean, When it comes to telemedicine, it is much easier for people living in the cities and in the urban areas to access certain services when compared with people in certain rural areas who feel much more restricted, even within their families and communities and community, sort of leaders. And there are huge accessibility issues when it comes to that. Not to say that there are no accessibility issues when it comes to cities, but it's more of a challenge when we're talking about a certain population in certain areas. And while telemedicine can change things drastically, what we do need to invest in is to have a structure around telemedicine, because I think at this point of time it's more like, there are digital platforms that are available and that people can use, but digital literacy is still a problem. So while we think of a solution, we also have to make sure that we realize what are some of the challenges that will come with, sort of making that channel really popular and acceptable and easy and accessible. Telemedicine definitely is a future. A bit of a problem is how do you work with non-judgmental, how do you have a network of non-judgmental pleasure-based providers as well when we're talking about telemedicine? Because maybe that's an idea that is totally workable, but how would you ensure that the person, sort of speaking to someone, because it's never going to be just prescribing a medicine. You also have some kind of contact where you need to be able to be assured that you have a right to access this service, and you will not be judged for what you're asking or what what the service that you're looking for. And I think all of these pieces of puzzle have to be worked on, and all of this has to come together for telemedicine to work. We also have to invest in making sure that the medical side of things, or the doctors that we are approaching, are also the ones who are informed, who use sex positive language, who are non-judgmental, and can make sure that the services are being given to people via telemedicine with ease and with comfort and without compromising on any of their personal data and confidentiality.
Yeah, and then that brings me on to the nub of the conversation. But in terms of recently what I've seen, and it could be a misrepresentation, is just a sort of flourishing of conversations around pleasure and about female pleasure in India, and it might be a certain segment of the population, but there does seem to be an increasing sort of legitimacy to the conversation about women being able to ask for pleasure, or even discussing the concept of female pleasure and female sexuality. And Love Matters has been right at the forefront of that in terms of sex positive sex education, and actually giving space to that conversation, which was stigmatized before. And I wonder if you've also seen a change, or whether also that's been a kind of slow increase, or with more people having access to the internet, or it changing in the media, and or if COVID has kind of accelerated that, because in some countries in the West we saw these conversations happening in the media in a way that I hadn't really seen before, in that it was less stigmatized. The discussion of the rise in sex toy sales, the discussion about being able to think about your sex life remotely and female pleasure within that. And I just wondered what you had seen in different contexts in India.
I think in India it's been quite gradual. And I think I'm delighted to share that I've seen this across section of society, and not just when we talk about a certain section living in the more urban part of the country. It's really interesting. I remember we were doing and this is 2 years back. Yeah, this is 2 years back when we were rolling out a project in Bihar. And we started with a workshop where we had recruited young male and female peer educators from the communities, and we worked together on certain ideas. We wanted them to think about their needs and the kind of information that is helpful for them. And through a 2-day process, we wanted them to work in groups and present certain ideas of what they felt was information that was much needed. And there was a group of girls from 3 villages in Bihar who had worked on an idea, and when they presented that in front of actually the whole group, but which also included key organizations who work in Bihar on family planning and SRHR issues, who almost, I think, had a shock, because these girls presented an idea which talked about female masturbation. It was delightful, it was so empowering. It was so interesting to see them confident standing there and, sort of saying that, well, this is the kind of information that I think would be really helpful, and I think more and more girls need to know about it. And something that, one would still debate, saying that, oh, we really don't think, girls want that information. But having worked in Bihar for this, for last 3-4 years, we have seen a big change in need of information, how, agency in terms of asking for information, talking much more confidently about their needs, asking the right questions about their bodies, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. I think that's been gradual, but it's been a slow and steady progress, I would say. And I would say that generally for the landscape and our work, what we have seen even on our platforms, online platforms, where we see much more acceptance for female pleasure. We see much more interesting conversations. We see conversations. I think that in itself is a big change, because the moment you start talking about something that doesn't appease the mass population, or that hits on male ego, or what we generally call the Indian values, people would just sort of either just sort of mark this content as ask that content to be taken down or reported or something. But what we have seen is a big change, because they engage in conversations, and I think that's really, really good. That's the first step forward, that we are engaging in conversation with a bigger audience and a wider audience, and we're talking so much more about it. We have more and more women on our platforms, and we have the highest female viewership right now on our online platforms are from Uttar Pradesh, and we can literally see the regions, the areas, and the age group, and the kind of questions they have. I think there has been gradual I would say acceptance around female pleasure, more and more people talking about it. And I think that is also supported by the general environment, if one would see that. When we're talking about popular media or mass media, we're talking about a lot of these young people, YouTubers, good and bad, sort of all categories. But you have a lot of young voices supporting the movement, making it much more mainstream at this point of time. So I think that's what has changed. I think we are becoming a bit more bold and edgy about putting it out there as it is. And there are many more voices and diverse voices, not really just voices from the non-profit world, right? Because that sometimes can be very isolating. And we have a very academic way of, sort of presenting certain things, non-profit. So that has possibly something that has never, sort of been a challenge. But now when you see the bigger, the bigger picture, you also see popular culture, you see popular media, you see different kinds of voices come together, and very diverse voices also from a very diverse demography, from India. So it's not really restricted to the English speaking population, but much more interesting content which is being made in different languages. It's making a huge difference, and I think so much more mainstream. I mean, one would have to come to the open mics and see how wonderful it is to see these young women and young voices, take onto the stage and talk so openly about pleasure. We have done a lot of open mics and getting young people together and on stage, because I think it's really important to hear from them, and it's been great. So I feel things have changed. I feel we could have, a closed door screening of female pleasure, with the support of Europe, all countries and whatever, which was great, because female pleasure did get screened across different cities, and which was very interesting. I think at Love Matters we have led these campaigns and college events to be very, very focused on pleasure, and we haven't had any kind of backlash. Which is also good news. So I think all of these things do point to an environment which is a little more progressive than where we were, I guess, a few years back.
That's great news, and great news in terms of all different contexts. I often think it's a bit of a global myth, actually, that the sort of urban elite are the ones that are more open about pleasure, but and other communities aren't. But I remember hearing the words of some pre-marriage songs in Madhya Pradesh and being a bit like, whoa. So it's a bit of a kind of myth that the rural, globally that's a myth, that the rural poor are less open to these conversations, or less happy to instigate them, or less able to talk about female pleasure. And if you look at old folk songs in the UK as well, they're pretty wild, some of them, in terms of the quite progressive conversations about pleasure, whereas we also assume that at this point of time we're in a more progressive place than times in the past, but it's not true actually.
In fact, I'm reminded of this research that was done a few years back with rural women in actually Madhya Pradesh, where they did look at how they did document the sex lives of women, which was sort of a shocker for a lot of people, but it was about expressing their sexuality in many more powerful and expressive ways than one would really imagine, even for urban India. I don't remember that, but it was a really, really interesting piece of research.
So it might have been that. It might have been the Naranda Trust, actually, that did it. I think it might have been them that I was talking to. But just lastly, it's really exciting to hear about these more open conversations and maybe facilitated by kind of more access to the internet, maybe not, but just it'd be great to hear about the plans with Love Matters. Love Matters has done a huge amount to change the environment and the nature of the conversations, and just wondering what plans you have, what plans ahead for pleasure positive sex education.
So for pleasure positive sex education, I think this is like our everyday lives. Every day when we think of content across platforms, everything is really centered around how do we have more sex positive conversations, how do we look at certain agreed realities, how do we bring these diverse stories, and how do we sort of make these conversations really, really mainstream. And I think so for us at Love Matters, everything that we are planning in short term is obviously linked to our long term goal of making sure that sex positive conversations are just mainstream for everyone, anywhere. And so for us at this point of time, I think a lot has been around Corona, but making sure that it is the sex positive conversation that we bring to these conversations around Corona and SRHR issues or family planning issues. So what we have really been focusing on is talking to young people, really listening a lot, talking to them about their struggles, getting a lot of diverse stories out there for our audience, and really sort of making sure that we are engaged with our audience, where we are talking about they're responding to their questions. Do you fear something, at this point of time? What are your fears, in terms of your relationship or having sex, and how is COVID impacting your personal life? What is it that, you can do or try? So a lot of it is very personal. I think we are really engaged in really personal stories, and really bringing that sex positive information to personal stories. That's what we are trying to do. And I think just in terms of reaching our audience, the broader audience, so we have to think of content in such variety of ways to the audience that we are talking in different settings. So it has to appeal to a whole set of audience. We have to bring in these conversations and make sure that we are speaking to also the other influences in people's lives. We are speaking to everyone and trying to see how do we create the sex positive environment where young people and adolescents feel supported by other people in the community, by be it parents or be it educators or be it the panchayat leaders or be it so different. We do a lot of indirect advocacy when it comes to government, because we do a lot of edgy stuff, and we do not want to change a thing about our approach. And we know the moment we get into direct advocacy, we might be forced to change a thing or two, which we are not interested in. But for us, the advocacy is with a wider audience. We want to change the way we look at we look at sex in India, as a taboo. We want to change the way, the whole idea is approached. We want to change the way people access information and access services. So we are really in the middle of it all. We're trying extremely hard to work with the medical providers and clinic partners, and making sure that sex positive information is also linked to sex positive services. They're able to access services without any shame and stigma, just understanding everything. So I guess that's our approach, and that's how we are growing, and we are bringing diverse stories, a lot of interesting stories to people. Actually, I think in middle of all of this chaos and a lot of stuff that people are reading and actually don't want to read, we're just trying to bring in happy, stories and relationship stories. Things are going to get better. Be safe, but yes, live it in an exciting way every single day. Make it exciting for yourself. So I think that's what we are really, really trying to do.
Well, I've no doubt from everything you've done to date to change the nature of the conversation, to reduce the taboos, that's where Love Matters will be taking the dialogue and taking the quality of sex education in India. I mean, one thing that both of us know is that the evidence shows us that sex-positive sex education is more effective. It leads to greater health outcomes. And I'm hoping that, in about 10 years' time, maybe earlier, could have this conversation again. And then at that point in time, maybe the world will start to say, how come we even had sex education that didn't include discussion of pleasure? How bizarre is that when sex is primarily motivated by pleasure for a lot of the world's population? Like, how odd would it be that it was omitted so heavily from sex education around the world?
And I do think, 10 years before and where we are today, and I'm very positive about the journey, ahead. I think there is progress. I think there are challenges, but I think there is good progress, and we are only going to march ahead with much optimism, and we'll get there.
Absolutely. And I think, World Sexual Health Day, it was the first time it was focused on pleasure. And I think you might have seen in the news that the Pope himself has talked about the importance of pleasure for eating and sex. So I think, if the Pope's behind us, there's nothing stopping us now.
Absolutely. I saw that tweet by the Pleasure Project, and I was delighted to see that. And I was like, wow, that's very interesting.
Thank you so much for your time. It's great to have you on Under the Duvet, literally under the duvet. And great to hear about everything that you're doing and Love Matters is doing. It's so exciting to see the way that you're changing the whole landscape of sex education. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne, and always looking at trailblazers like you who have been leading the movement. And, I think it's great, and you guys are doing great stuff, and you inspire us every single day. So cheers to the pleasure movement.